Hey everybody, it's Brennan, and Patrick and I want to announce something very, very exciting before we get into today's episode. We would like to share with you Deadhead Review's very first Horror in Hollywood short story competition.
Patrick here. It is theme-based, the Horror in Hollywood. Horror stories set in and around the glitz and glamour of Hollywood. Your story can take place at any period of Hollywood history, from the beginning days of silent black and white movies to the modern era of big Hollywood blockbusters. Be creative, cross-genre is welcome.
As far as the rules are concerned, we are looking for a maximum word count of 4,000 words, and we would like you to know that we are interested in standalone prose fiction stories. No TV, movie, play script treatments, or novel or novella extracts will be accepted.
Brennan and I will be on the panel of judges alongside Elle Turpett, Rich Gerlach, Cassie Daly, S.H. Cooper, and possibly more.
The contest is open starting on September 15th, and it's going to run all the way to September 30th. More contact information for that can be found on the Deadhead site, which I'll give in just a minute. As far as prizes go, there's a lot of good stuff in store, including promotional packages, editing services, and you could even be a guest on this very show that you're about to listen to.
For more information, go to deadheadreviews.com. And on that website, there is a content submissions page under that current open calls. Welcome to Dead Headspace. I'm your host, Patrick R. McDonough, and even though Brennan just did the ad with me, today this is just me. I spoke with my guest, Jim Harberson. He is a writer. What we're specifically talking about is a graphic novel called Stay Alive. This was the third episode, chronologically episode 3 that I ever recorded. That was back in March 16th, 2020. This was actually 4 days before Brennan and I recorded our first episode together. That one was episode 3, I believe, where it is our first horror classics. We talk about Jack Ketchum's The Girl Next Door. So I hope that you all enjoy this. And the sound quality, I improved over time, so I hope that you forgive me. Enjoy. My guest today is the co-author of a new and exciting graphic novel, Stay Alive. Please welcome Jim Harberson. Hey, Jim.
Hey, how are you?
I'm pretty good. So I was really excited when I first saw Stay Alive being promoted online. I kind of had to get my hands on it, even though I'm very new to graphic novels. I was just curious if you could tell us a little bit about the backstory of where the idea came from and your team that you've worked with on previous projects with.
Sure. Well, the idea, I don't know, it came out of the blue, I suppose, sometime in 2014. I was spitballing with my co-author, Mackie Wildwood. We had written a couple of screenplays together by that point, and we were trying to come up with an idea for a horror story. And lo and behold, I was thinking about, I think this was around the time social media were starting to really wax ugly, that they were disclosing people's worst tendencies online, to use their anonymity or their distance or both to do things that they would never do in person. And so it occurred to me, what if you could weaponize this somehow and use it against people, in a real way, not just psychological terror, but actual murder. And so we ran with it from there. And the Mackie is a longtime friend of mine. We went to high school together. And our artist, Stephen Baskerville, lives in England. And we retained him for a project we worked on a few years ago called Death Cat. I sent you Death Cat. It's a short web comic. It's a horror comedy based on a story that came out of Rhode Island. Apparently there was this palliative care home cat that was supposed to be an emotional comfort animal, and it started bombing onto people who were next to die eerily. I guess that people dying emit pheromones or something, and cats sense this and they're attracted to it for whatever reason. And so it was creepy, right? And it's a fun thing at the same time. So we came up with a story idea. Well, what would happen if the staff at a nursing home discovered the same phenomenon and decided to start wagering on it? Because I imagine you have to have something of a sense of humor if you're working around death and decay all day, or else you'll go mad if you can't cope with it. So, we did that, and we hired Stephen Baskerville to illustrate it. And when we resolved to do Stay Alive as a graphic novel, we thought he would be perfect for it. So Mackie Wildwood, my friend, that's a pseudonym for my friend he works in finance, and he tries to keep his regular day job life separate from his avocation as an author. So we started working on it in 2014, and then we hired the artist to start working on it in 2016, and gradually got it done last year. And we finished it last year, and then shopped it to publishers and got picked up by Marcosia. Marcosia is a British publisher, and we're quite delighted with them, and very humbled that they chose us, and grateful that they did. And it's been well received, and we're quite pleased with that. We're glad that it's obviously not a story for everybody. It has some extreme content.
Yep.
But at the same time, I think that the extreme content is rendered in such a way as you might see on Rick and Morty or Mr. Pickles on Adult Swim. One of my friends was telling me that she sees it as the kind of violence sort of that you might see in a video game like Fortnite. It doesn't bother her that her kids play Fortnite because the violence is stylized and absurd. It's not intended to be exploitative or graphic or appealing to the prurient interest, to borrow an old obscenities standard chestnut. So we're quite pleased with how it's doing, and of course we're so happy that you enjoyed it, and thank you again for that wonderful review.
Oh, absolutely. I in my I can't say close now, but my circle of friends in the horror community, I've seen everyone that's read it likes it. I think, like you said, it's not for everybody, only for the fact that some people would take it at a surface level, but I think you just made it pretty clear that the reason why you did it was for kind of explain how society is with technology. And I'm 31, so I feel like I'm the last generation to witness the evolution of social media, and beyond that, the evolution of the internet. I can remember a time when I played video games without any access to the internet.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. In fact, internet access is... Yeah, I grew up playing video games. There was no such thing as the internet. You just... even when I played video games, like, say, in my 20s, it was on a PlayStation, and it was just a disc, and you weren't linked to the internet. It was all self-contained, and now you're right. It's if you're not online, unless you have a game that's self-contained, you're doing something wrong, or not wrong, but I think you're possibly, you risk being seen as being behind the times, because video games have become much more social, social interaction is often important, unless you're playing a game that's designed as a one-player adventure quest like The Last of Us, say, or Uncharted, or the campaign mode in Call of Duty.
Yeah, absolutely. And speaking of video games, Stay Alive, if this was a video game, I would love it due to the cartoonishly extreme gore in it. Like there's this one example. The first one that caught my eye is pretty early on. I'm flipping through the pages right now. It's a panel where it's a 180-degree panel. I don't know if that's the proper term, but it's the main killer ripping off a hospital employee's arms and just whacking the shit out of that employee with their own arms as they die and bleed to death.
Yes.
And then it cuts to another guy getting torn apart. Was it beheaded by a propeller, a helicopter propeller?
The Kenyon Craft, the serial killer, he sprung from the insane asylum where he's being kept.
Yeah.
And he, as he's leaving with the orderly who's been paid off to help him escape, a nurse confronts them and points out the irregularity of his being out of his cell. And so he grabs the nurse's arms and rips them off and bludgeons the nurse to death. And then once they're on the roof, maybe to cover his tracks, maybe just because he's, a psychopath who's, sort of buzzing on being able to kill people again, he just grabs the orderly and tosses him into the helicopter blades, So I guess that check doesn't have to clear, right? So, and he just, I thought I'd have fun with the absurdity of the kills you see in horror film franchises like Halloween, or more specifically perhaps Friday the 13th and Nightmare on Elm Street, where, in the Nightmare on Elm Street sequels, Freddy becomes this cartoon of his original self, in which he people cheer him on as he comes up with more and more elaborate ways of killing people. And it's so over the top that, it's hard to be disturbed by it in one sense, because it's so unreal. I mean, it's still disturbing if you look at it on one level, because he's just dispatching these innocent teenagers, and they may be obnoxious and annoying characters, but that doesn't mean they deserve to be slaughtered.
Right.
And the same with the victims in the Friday the 13th movie, though that is far less Baroque. It's just new ways of putting farm and garden implements into people. So it's Halloween is, I guess if you were to award medals for it, it would be the gold medal to Freddy, the silver to Jason, and the bronze to Michael Myers in terms of the inventiveness and playfulness of their murder sprees. And so I was thinking, how do we make this sort of fun as a wink and a nod to the tradition of serial killers murdering people in absurd and over the top ways. And, it fortifies the unreality of everything and makes it more tolerable accordingly. So just like I said in Rick and Morty, for example, or Mr. Pickles.
Those are good examples. I totally get it, and I agree. So where did Kenyon Craft come from? Did he was he inspired by any actual serial killer?
No, I was just thinking of, what would I wanted to create a character. He's the real locus of the horror aspect of Stay Alive, and so I wanted him to be my favorite horror movie growing up was Halloween 2, the original Halloween 2 from 1981. And that movie just blew my mind because it took a place, a hospital, which is supposed to be a sanctuary of healing and safety, and turns it into a slaughterhouse.
Absolutely.
And it was creepy. It was masterfully executed in that, Michael just quietly eradicates everyone, all the staff members, and then pursues Jamie Lee Curtis through the sort of grotesque tableau he's created in the hospital. And so I was inspired by that for the final chapter, or the third act of Stay Alive, where Kraft pursues Jane Morgan through the FBI offices, which are littered with the dead, So it's like a journey through hell or something. And so one of the things that's really scary about Michael Myers is he is utterly without emotional affect, by and large. I mean, occasionally one of his victims or would-be victims will say, "Michael," and he'll sort of stop, and suddenly there's a flash of his humanity, but he quickly recovers and returns to form. And I wanted Kenyon Kraft to be like that, to be relentless and, sort of effortless in his killing, but not a cartoon or supernatural. I mean, Michael Myers is sort of supernatural in his ability to survive, and he never says anything. I at least wanted Kenyon Kraft to understand where Kenyon Kraft's animus towards Jane came from. I mean, clearly he was a damaged and troubled individual, and Jane's callous treatment of him kind of set him off. And, it contributed to her character arc as well. You see Jane as this careless, callous person who needs to be redeemed through the horrific vortex of the events in Stay Alive.
Absolutely. Well said. And I can't really make a current modern day because I don't pay attention to pop references nowadays for the most part. But if I were relating Jane to a popular female pop, like the biggest pop icon back when I was growing up, I'd say she reminds me of Britney Spears. Just solely on the fact that they're both pretty women. They're both on top of their game. They're well known throughout the world, and then they kind of hit this plateau, and they both do something a little nutty.
So that was, I mean, the idea, the Hollywood starlet who breaks bad, to borrow a phrase, is sort of an old and sad story, and it's a trope almost, and so we were thinking, well, how could we have fun with that? Because that's where the idea came from. Well, if we were to do Stay Alive just as from a point of view of a victim, first of all, most of the victims, the victims prior to Jane, are not desirable as a lead character. They are all guilty of terrible things. And moreover, if you were simply to do a story wherein someone is being pursued by Yukil, a character you already don't like, it's not that interesting, which is why I wanted to, change it up with the idea of the main character exploiting her own calamity for profit, so that she can sort of make good on or find a silver lining in her unfortunate circumstances.
Hmm.
And, I thought that allowed, a much more robust story and more social commentary, other than just what would essentially become kind of a story that's been told many, many times and very well, of a person who's, on the run, being pursued by, killer or killers. I thought that story has been done really well, like I said, and I thought I didn't want to exactly tell that story. I wanted to tell a different story.
I liked it. I empathized with Jane Morgan. I thought she was, in the beginning, when it's like, the cliche starlet thing. Like, you played a lot of cliche things very nicely. Like with Jane Morgan being just your typical, at first she seems like a typical character, and then you start to really empathize for her. And over time, she becomes this kick-ass character, and I really like that.
Thank you.
Yeah,
but that was the hope. We wanted to take you from despising her to rooting for her.
It works.
And to basically to change the moral polarity, if I can use that as a metaphor, of of the story, so that you go from sort of rooting for Yukil to rooting for Jane.
Mm. Okay. And another thing, in the third act, when you have a bunch of panels where it's showing different parts of the world, where there's people rooting for, I think it was Knox in the beginning, and then so you see like an obese American family, you see frat boys, and then over time you start to see them shift gears from not liking her to being Team Jane. I thought that was good social commentary. Like I thought it was pretty. It's in your social commentary is really in your face, and it does it well. And that's why I don't know if you guys do, but that's why I classified it as a splatterpunk story. You used horror as your tool for social commentary to make your point on.
Right.
How society is with technology, how we're all quick to just kind of condemn people. There are complicated stories, but we try to. I think that a lot of people kind of just see things as black and white, and it's really never ever black and white.
Right. Two of my favorite films, the two of the films that really helped. Well, there are three films that really inspired me to create this. The first was The Running Man, which came out in 1987, starring Arnold Schwarzenegger.
Yeah.
It's based on a Stephen King novel.
Right.
And it's set in this future dystopian America in which a despotic government is taken over, and the biggest television show in America is called The Running Man, in which social enemies of the state are put through this gauntlet and hunted by these celebrity gladiators and murdered on live television. And the same year, the original RoboCop came out, and that was co-authored and I think directed by Ed Neumeyer, who also wrote my third movie, which is the adaptation of Starship Troopers.
Oh, yes.
The original in 1997.
Yeah.
And all three of these movies focus on the commodification of human suffering. RoboCop, of course, is about a Detroit police officer who's killed in the line of duty and turned into a cyborg and is treated like company property. He's OCP property. Even though he's still a human being, he still has human emotions and a free will. He's treated like property. He can be destroyed. He has fewer rights in some ways than a public toilet has. And in Starship Troopers is about, and it's based on the Robert Heinlein novel, and the premise is that this intelligent insect alien species attacks Earth, and so Earth sends Starship Troopers, Space Marines after them to destroy them. And the focus is on human beings seeing themselves not as individuals, but as a species that is trying to wipe out a species that's trying to wipe them out. And it's in all three stories, the abdication, or not abdication, but the erasure of human dignity and the destruction of the considerations of individual rights are central to what is truly horrific about what's going on. And so that's what modern social media can easily enable. People feel empowered to, you see it all the time.
Yeah.
People feel empowered to say terrible, terrible things about other people.
Over nothing.
Yes, exactly. It's everybody goes nuclear. Everybody's, sort of caught up in hyperbole all the time. It's all or nothing. There's no nuance. There's no middle ground. It's just kill, 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 destroy, destroy, destroy. And, it reminds me of Immanuel Kant's injunction. I think it's from the Prologue to the Metaphysics of Morals. Immanuel Kant is a very famous philosopher, and he more or less devised the architecture of modern secular morality in the West. And he had this comment. I think it was in the prologue of Metaphysics of Morals. And my professor, when I studied it, kept coming back to this because it was as a refrain, because it really shows that even Kant realized that you can only do so much with people being people. It's out of the crooked timber of humanity, no straight thing can ever be made. And, Kant, I think Kant was the son of a pietist preacher. And so he had this, he was raised with this concept of original sin in people that, no matter how progressive you try to be, how well educated people are, or how well intentioned, there's a rottenness in people that inevitably, exposes itself. And, the idea that you can sort of eradicate it from people, is probably the only thing that's more terrifying than the things that it can be responsible for. So,
yeah, that is real interesting. Because I don't feel I like history, so I like to, and I particularly love learn about Roman Empire or colonization of America. Those are areas where I really enjoy, and even going further back. We always have the same sort of core about us where we kind of are still, monkeys, just with smarter. We have a smarter, more complex way of thinking.
Yes.
I don't think it ever changes. We just get better toys.
Yeah, I mean, people are capable of terrific acts of grace and other-centeredness.
Sure.
I mean, people are capable of moral heroism, but at the same time, they're also capable of utterly terrible things. And so, and it's this classic, it's the human condition to try and reconcile these urges. And in social media, we see, people are just, I don't know what it is. Maybe it's like a safety valve that allows people to say terrible things they have to repress in their normal lives. I used to make the argument, you're familiar with Howard Stern, right?
Yeah.
When Howard Stern was really being, over the top and edgy back in the 80s and 90s, I used to think of him as kind of a safety valve for popular culture. Like, he could, like other comedians, he could say things other people were thinking but weren't allowed to say, right?
Yeah.
And now that opportunity in some ways has been given to people on social media, though the ability of people to, if people become sufficiently notorious or well known, they can't get away with it anymore. But, average people who are not particularly well known can still, say terrible things on social media. And I'm not sure that they pay much of a price for it most of the time because people aren't paying attention. And, it's easier always to escalate things when there are no real stakes than it is if you're in a situation where it might actually descend into violence.
Sure. And isn't that funny that Howard Stern was considered the taboo person of the day, but nowadays he's just, it's nothing compared to what you can be offended by today.
Yes. And that's the other thing that's really funny is that people now take offense at things that I think people used to be much more calloused, and now people are much more prone to take offense at things that perhaps they wouldn't necessarily take offense at anymore. So, and I think that kind of fuels it. There's an irrepressible narcissism that fuels social media. And, I think it adds to the toxicity. And that's why, people feel like if everything is personal, then they have to defend their personal integrity all the time because they feel like it's under assault. And so, you have, it's like the idea of democracy in some ways. When people are responsible for writing the law or voting for certain things, and it's not dictated to them by a king or something, then I think they're more inclined to take it personally. And especially in America where people think that, they see a problem and they think it should be resolved. There ought to be a law, And there's this sort of dictatorial fascistic impulse in the American character to want to outlaw things and punish people severely for doing things that they disapprove of. And H.L. Mencken, the famous writer for the Baltimore Sun, the social commentator, talked about this. He has a famous quote about how, bettering your fellow man is the American disease, and that you will make people better by force if necessary, right? And, so we have that, something that becomes something that's well-intentioned starts out being well-intentioned, but turns into a kind of toxic, dictatorial demand that, people behave in a certain way, or else we chuck you in jail. Right. Americans have there's a famous quote by de Tocqueville. It might be from Democracy in America, but he said that which was written in the early 19th century, I think in the 1830s, and he came to America and wrote the famous treatise about American culture and mores, and he said that in Europe, if you're a fugitive from justice, people view you with sympathy. In America, if you're a fugitive from justice, people want to join into the mob that's hunting the fugitive, right? So it's like that wonderful Simpsons episode. I think it's the episode where the town gets together to burn down the local house of prostitution, and they're converging on it with pitchforks and torches. And one of the characters said, "There's no justice quite like mob justice."
So pretty true to today's standards.
That's what we see. We see people galvanized by a sense of moral righteousness, and it excuses terrible things. There's a wonderful quote, I think I'm getting it right, from Nietzsche. He said, beware when you go hunting monsters that you don't yourself become a monster. Something to that effect. And I think what he meant when he said that was that if you're sufficiently galvanized by a sense of moral righteousness, you may dispatch with the things that would otherwise make you a moral person or give you pause, because you're so goal-oriented that, you're willing to do anything to succeed.
Right. Yeah, that's a scary truth right there. Has this novel, has it gotten any backlash at all for any of the graphic brutality in it?
Not that I've heard. I mean, I'm sure that there are people who have read it and been put off by it, but fortunately, no one has confronted me, or that I know have written anything to say that this is horrible and, pick your adjective. So I'd like to think that if people give it a fair read, they'll see it for what it is and not as some celebration of excess, but more of a it uses extreme content as a way of commenting on human society, particularly American society, as filtered through social media.
So I took it.
And our willingness to monetize just about any kind of human suffering, as long as it's being had by consenting adults. So.
Yeah. So I'm real curious. I don't know a whole lot about your background. What I did see is that you went to Cornell, Yale, and University of Pennsylvania. I was curious what you went to school for at any of those schools, and if it had anything to do that would end up influencing you or kind of having a role in you as a writer.
Yes, I was a classics and English major at Cornell.
Okay.
Classics is ancient Greek and Roman literature and history and philosophy. And I went to Yale Divinity School and concentrated in historical theology, which is the history of Christian thought. And then after that went to law school at the University of Pennsylvania. And I would say that being well-schooled in Western thought and philosophy and having a really good background in debate and critical thinking about issues, learning to think dispassionately about things that are inherently polarizing was a gift, very useful. In fact, when I was in Cornell, I took the final class ever taught by Carl Sagan, the famous astronomer.
Oh, yeah.
It was a critical thinking seminar. And he made us, one of the things he made us do was write a paper about a topic that was really polarizing, really controversial, such as abortion or affirmative action or, any other political topic that really got people energized. And what you had to do was pair off with someone in the class who had an opposite view of the topic, or at least was willing to take the opposite view that you had, and then to write a paper together. So you had to put aside your, deeply held beliefs and, come to some kind of agreement in the form of a paper. And I thought that was an extraordinarily useful exercise. And law school teaches you to do that too, if it's functioning correctly. It teaches you, which is something that's a little bit of a lost art, unfortunately, the ability to approach things no matter how much they may affect you emotionally, and to try and discern, why do people think this way, and, how can I understand them better? Because if you can understand people, you can at least try to communicate with them. And communication and debate, that is civilization.
Yeah.
And if we're not doing that, we're pillaging and destroying, right?
Yeah.
So I would say that after that, in the course of my legal career, I ended up doing a lot of criminal defense work and civil rights litigation. And I saw often the systematic dehumanization of people, clients, especially in the criminal defense arena. And it was terribly frightening. I like to say, I have friends who say, how can you think these terrible things that you write about? And as far as I'm concerned, nothing that I write about is anywhere near as terrifying or disturbing as the things I've seen in the real world. So, I just, I had a client once who almost died in police custody in jail because the health services were inadequate, and he was bitten by a brown recluse spider. He developed a staph infection. All of this was documented. He almost died, and it was horrifying. Just it's not in all places, but in many places in this country, I think that if you're a criminal convict or a defendant, a lot of people just write you off as not being worthwhile anymore. Yeah, I have a theory sometimes that, there's this, America was founded by Puritans, some of whom, if I'm not mistaken, have very strong beliefs in predestination, that God had already determined who was damned and who was elect. And so I think that, people that's still running around in our, if America has a subconscious, a cultural subconscious, that's still running around in the subconscious or constitutive of it. And so I think that people assume that, well, if God has already written you off, then why can't we, right? And God has obviously already written you off because look at you're a terrible criminal and you're in jail and your life is horrible. And so obviously you're not elect, right?
Right. And that's kind of a shame how, in my opinion, that people misconstrued good ideas for religion, which would be just, without getting into detail, I think it should just basically be a good person and don't be a judgmental prick. I know, for example, prostitutes, if you're that or porn star or something along those lines, a lot of people will just treat you like a second citizen. And I know for a fact in some areas, without saying where, that cops really don't give a shit about prostitutes. And I don't think that's right. And it is pretty sickening. And anyone that reads Stay Alive or other works that you've done that exploit that, I'd really stop and reflect on what's going on in front of them. Like, you're just making social commentary. That's what good authors do. That's what good artists do. Yeah,
I agree. And I don't want to say, I don't want to paint with a really broad brush. I mean, there are plenty. I worked with plenty of police officers and law enforcement people who were righteous. They were good people,
Sure.
and they were trying to do a very hard job. But the system and the cultural attitudes that I sometimes saw, towards people who were my clients, I think were appalling. And I think that for some people, that is a decision they make. They just decide that, people who do certain things are irredeemable, and we can, if they would simply die so they could save us money, all the better. But I think some people just absorb prejudices like any other prejudice, and they never really think about it until they're given pause to think about it. So, and it's a very revealing thing to represent, to be real with people who are very different from you, and to understand life from their perspective, and to understand that maybe they, especially if they were born without privileges that many people in this country enjoy.
Mm.
And, it's an education. When I was at Yale, there were all manner of homeless people throughout the campus begging for change or cigarettes or whatever. And it was just part of your experience there, because New Haven it was really depressed when I was there. I think it's maybe a little better, but it's still fairly depressed. And it was an education in and of itself, because you had this, world-class institution with a multi-billion-dollar endowment filled with privileged kids, and at the same time you have grotesque poverty side by side with it. So it's an interesting juxtaposition, to say the least.
Absolutely. My wife has opened my eyes to a lot of things. She's a social worker, and she used to work in Lake City, and she would help veterans. There'd be a row of homes, and it would be a program where it would help them to sort of recircuit the way they think about jobs, money. It would help them to become independent.
Right.
And I mean, if I didn't know they were homeless, I wouldn't. That's the crazy thing. Like, you stop and think, oh, a homeless person looks like this, for example. And no, they don't. There's many looks to everything. And she opened my eyes in the sense where, like, if you gotta stop and think, like, people in prison, like you brought up earlier, they are treated, once they're out, probably pretty bad too. And it's strange to think that we can be so quick to judge, which brings me back to my earlier point of the internet and social media. I think that kind of is why we are the way we are, the way we have all these judgmental thoughts. And I think you touched on that too. We just use it as a tool. And it's scary because any one of us could do it.
Right. And the other thing is that because what's politically acceptable is dynamic, you can be on the side of the angels one day and the target of the righteous mob the next. So it's really a terrifying phenomenon, and it's funny because we seem to have lost our capacity for mercy in some ways as a society. I mean, I wouldn't say completely. I'm sure that, most Americans are able to forgive one another, but we have this kind of, we have this intolerance for any kind of error, and this desire to see destroyed often people who fall into error. It's, it's like the Inquisition during the Middle Ages.
Yeah.
If you ever want to read a really scary book, there's a compilation of original sources in translation by Alan Charles Coors. Is it Alan Charles or Charles Allen? Coors and Edmund Peters. They're scholars of the Enlightenment at the University of Pennsylvania, and it's a book about witchcraft and the oppression of witches from 700 to 1400 AD. And you just read about the witchcraft hunting hysteria that convulsed Europe over many centuries, and all the people who were put to death and tortured in the name of, driving out the devil and public order and God's righteousness. And like I said, it's much more frightening than anything I could write. There was a town, I think, in Germany in which, everyone ended up accusing everybody else, not completely, but that witchcraft accusations proliferated, and somebody figured out that there are too many people making too much money off of this, because everyone participating in the court system or the civic machinery of the trial and judgment and execution of witches got paid. And as soon as they started reducing the fees of the people who participated in that system, the number of witchcraft accusations fell off. So it's kind of like the theory some historians advanced about the Salem witchcraft trials. I think it was back in the 1970s that they did a study and they found that a lot of the people accusing their neighbors had property disputes with their neighbors over because they had adjoining properties. So they used the fear of witches to win their beefs in the most horrific way possible.
That's terrifying. So, have you ever been to the Salem Witch Trial Museum? It's in Salem, Mass.
No, I should have. I went to high school in Massachusetts, but I have not.
Where'd you go?
I went to Deerfield Academy.
Okay, I don't know if you're familiar, but I live in. So that's in North Massachusetts, isn't it? The northern part.
Western. It's about an hour and a half from Boston. Yeah, it's in Western Mass. It's near Springfield. It's about a half hour from Springfield.
Wow, yeah, I'm way off. So I don't know that area very well, but I'm from Bridgewater, Massachusetts, and it's just pretty much directly in between Boston and Providence. I've been to Salem 3 times during October, and it's pretty great. I brought my wife there. We went to that museum. It's really interesting. It's pretty terrifying what the women went through, and one guy in particular. And Cotton Mather, if it wasn't for him, I don't think we know a whole lot about what happened, because he's pretty much the one that recorded everything. And that guy is a prolific writer. I think he wrote over
300 books or something.
Yeah. And I know that he has a connection with Benjamin Franklin too, which is real interesting. It was his book. I don't remember the one, but a book that he wrote inspired Benjamin Franklin to pretty much be the person he was, and it's arguable that he's Franklin's like the biggest influence in how America is nowadays. So I think Cotton Mathers is someone that is worth studying if someone's interested in this field.
Yeah, I think I read that he was denied the presidency of Harvard University or Harvard College at the time because of his role in the Salem witchcraft trials.
No kidding.
There was a backlash after people sobered up and realized how horrible the things that they had done were, and I think they needed a scapegoat. They always need a scapegoat, right? So the mob turns on its leader eventually, and he was one of the leaders. So it's
sorry.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, but whenever you harness irrational emotional energy, you have to be careful. It's like having, the old cliche, the tiger by the tail. You never really control it, right? You just are able to control it for a little while, but eventually you lose control of it because it's too volatile and dynamic to be disciplined for too long.
The One Ring.
Right.
Yeah, I agree. It's a scary thing. Have you actually seen the show Salem?
No, I have not.
It just
I haven't
seen
it.
I think they canceled it after the 3rd season. I watched it when it came out. It's pretty neat. It's absolutely fiction. Cotton Mathers is the main character, but the Puritans, I'm so glad I did not live back then, because I'm pretty sure I would die pretty quickly with them.
Yeah, well, I remember reading a book by a sociologist. There was this famous sociologist at Harvard named Daniel Bell, and he wrote a book back in the 70s that's really excellent called The Cultural Contradictions of Capitalism. And in the preface, he talked about how the Puritans, one of the reasons the Puritans were so busybodied, why they were so concerned about the sins of their neighbors, was that they had a much more tribalistic view of themselves in the eyes of God, much more like the Hebrew scriptures, that they were like the nation of Israel, and the sins of the nation would be the punishment for the sins of the nation would be visited on everyone, not the individual transgressors. So they had a far less individualistic conception of Christianity than was possible. And so they accordingly tried very hard to prevent other members of the community from doing things that would end up having everyone punished by an angry God.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm not part of that cliche.
Right. So the idea of individual responsibility is erased. And so you have a moral imperative, a good reason, if not a moral imperative, to, be up in your neighbor's business, because your neighbor's business may end up getting you, lashed by God.
Which kind of brings us back to the whole social media thing where we've never grown up. We just have nicer toys.
Yeah. Yeah. And, people are, the other thing is that we live in an age that, because we prize individuality, it's ironic. I mean, it's a good thing we prize individuality, because individuality is how people experience reality. And when you get rid of individual rights, inevitably terrible things happen. Mm-hmm. But when people are so focused on their issues that they can't see other people's needs or wants as being just as important sometimes, and they become so narcissistic that they're imprisoned by themselves, then, you get an equally terrible, well, not equally, but you can get terrible outcomes too. You get people who just can't see past their own concerns, and society starts to fall apart. And like I said, there's no forgiveness because everybody. There's a very famous law review article written by a law professor at Yale named Arthur Allen Leff, came out in 1977, I think, or 79, called Unspeakable Ethics, Unnatural Law. And it's wonderful. And he talks about the fact that the modern condition renders every person a god unto himself, or a godlet, as he says. And, therefore, nobody really has the right to tell anybody what to do. I mean, we have society because we have mutual interests that are best served by cooperative action. But at the end of the day, people who see themselves as gods see any affront to their interests or their reputation or respectability as an affront to God, right? Mm. So, and God shall not be mocked, right?
Right.
So that's why Jane in Stay Alive, her greatest moment, her most important inflection point is when she, discovers her humility and says, okay, enough of this. Just take me. Don't kill anyone else.
That's a turning point. Are there any books? First off, do you read often?
I do. I try to read a lot. I haven't read as much recently because I've been working on other things, but yeah, I read a lot. So.
What books do you tend to read? Is it one genre, or is it just a slew of diversity?
I read lots of stuff. I read a lot of philosophy. I read a lot of comic books. And I like to read... I read a lot of last year, I went on a binge of science fiction. I think I read about 19 science fiction books in a row as a kind of, immersion in the genre, because I hadn't read a lot of science fiction for a while.
Do you like old stuff like Jules Verne, or are you into more modern, contemporary science fiction?
I prefer more contemporary, sort of mid-20th century onward.
Ray Bradbury, are you a fan of him?
Yes. Yes, definitely.
He's great.
In fact, I came in, one of the other seminal influences on me were the EC comics of the 1950s.
Yeah.
Tales from the Crypt, Weird Science, all those. And he actually had many stories adapted in the horror and science fiction comics.
Weird Tales too, I think.
Yeah. And I loved, one of the things I liked about EC was that even though they had different styles of title, they tended, outside of the war titles, to have O. Henry endings, and there was always this sort of ghoulish sense of humor that informed almost everything they were doing, or this, sense of a sort of a sad sense of irony about the world, that would people ever escape their own tragic flaws? It was great. I remember they had this, in the horror comics, they would do these retellings of famous fairy tales with an EC twist. And the one they did for Hansel and Gretel was great, because in the end, Hansel and Gretel get chucked into the oven by the witch.
I didn't know that.
In the last panel, the witch is saying, "Were you expecting Hansel and Gretel to escape? Come on, this is an EC magazine. That's not going to happen." Just breaking the fourth wall was fantastic, and it was totally over the top. And yes, it's horrible, but at the same time, you can't help but chuckle because, they're tweaking your expectations.
For me, my EC Comics is Creepshow. I forget when I discovered the first one, which quickly I discovered the second one. I haven't seen the show yet. I never bothered to watch the third one because I don't think it's the original trio. Tom Savini, George Romero, obviously not George Romero, and Stephen King. But as soon as I found the first two, I was in love, and I think they're like cousins with the Tales of the Crypt. And
oh yeah, Stephen King, I think Danse Macabre says that the EC comics were also instrumental in his creative formation. I
haven't read that in years. I forgot that part.
Yeah. I actually, my favorite is there was a comic book adaptation of the original Creepshow with art by Bernie Wrightson. That's just fantastic. I think I read that before I'm pretty sure I read that. Yeah, I read that before I ever saw the movie. And it's just like an EC comic. They have a weird narrator and 5 stories with twist endings. And, it's, the irony was what made so many of the EC stories so impactful and amazing. You try to avoid some terrible thing. It's like Oedipus Rex. You know that there's some existential threat to you, and you end up becoming that threat yourself, notwithstanding everything you try to do to prevent the threat.
Right. Do you have a favorite short in either Creepshow 1 or 2?
Oh, that's a good question.
Or favorites? Do you have a few?
The first Creepshow, the crate story about the werewolf in the crate.
Yeah, that was one of mine too. I was going to go with that too.
Hal Holbrook uses it to dispatch his terrible wife. His wife uses it. Yeah, that's my favorite. So
I also liked. Is it in the first one where? Actually, I'm looking it up right now online. It is. So I'm thinking of the one. It's titled "They're Creeping Up on You," where it's that rich asshole in the hotel.
Yeah, E.T. Marshall lives in this clean space.
Yeah,
He ends up being eaten from within by cockroaches. Yeah.
That was pretty cool, and I particularly love the ending where all the cockroaches just climb out of him in every orifice.
Yeah, and it's like, what's the worst possible thing that could happen to you if you were a clean freak? And it's that, and it's the metaphor is that he's so clean on the outside, but he's so rotten on the inside. The supernatural impact is that his personal rottenness, eclipses any of his, exterior cleanliness or righteousness or whatever. So, he has this, the wife of one of his former employees calls to say that her husband committed suicide after he fired the guy. And his response is, well, I did the world a favor, or he did the world a favor by killing himself, or something like that, something terrible, and, so the metaphorical truth of his character eventually destroys him. It's very interesting.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I actually like the first one more than Creepshow 2. And you said earlier you're a filmmaker as well, I believe.
I'm not a filmmaker. I've written a lot of screenplays, but I'm not
okay. Just you're a screenwriter.
Yes.
I'm not familiar with what you've written as far as that goes. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, I haven't had any screenplays developed, so that's why you're unfamiliar with them.
Okay. I couldn't find anything, so that makes sense.
I'm working, but yeah, I actually started out wanting to be a graphic novelist, and I went into screenplay writing, and I see, because a graphic novel in some ways is like a movie. It should be, in my opinion, mostly visual. You should convey most of the information visually, just like you do in a movie or when you're writing a screenplay. And, ideally, it's like I said, it's a visual experience more than anything else. And that's what I tried to do with Stay Alive. I tried to minimize absolutely the number of words used in it so that the art could tell the story.
I did a good job with that. I really like it. The style of art too, what Baskerville does. Is this something that you and your partner want to maybe try to sell and pitch for a film?
Yeah, we're working on that. So.
Well, I would I'd watch that. Is there any other projects that you can discuss?
Not at the moment, no.
Okay.
That are worth discussing. Yeah, no. Sorry.
Not a big deal.
I mean, I've definitely got other projects that I've completed or are working on, but right now I'm working on trying to get a film version of Staying Alive going. That and marketing Stay Alive are my two primary foci right now.
How did and I do apologize if I asked this earlier or you mentioned it earlier, but I don't think that we got too much into detail about how you and Marcosia kind of hooked up. What was that process like? Because they're a big publisher, aren't they?
Yeah, I solicited them, and the publisher, the owner, Harry Marcos, got back to me really quickly and said, I'm in. It was like, wow, and, we went from there, and we had to adapt it a little bit to their format because the format of the graphic novel is slightly smaller than the typical American graphic novel or comic book format in terms of dimensions. And then, otherwise it was not that difficult. And, we got it up and running. So it's on Comixology now. It just debuted on Comixology last week, which is, you're probably familiar with it. I think it's the biggest retail comic forum in the world now. It's all online and it's owned by Amazon. It was started by, I don't know who started it a few years ago, but Amazon acquired it, and it allows you to read comic books and to focus on individual panels. It's quite unique and interesting. So,
unlike a lot of my peers, I'm not big into comics. I am though starting to get into horror comics. I never really knew. It sounds really dumb, but I never knew that. Besides DC Comics, I never knew or thought about horror comics as being a thing. Because I was big into horror films. I didn't start really reading until after high school. Before and high school just killed my interest in reading. I think it was due to the curriculum trying to force me to read books. And one book in particular, All Quiet on the Western Front. I love history, but that book sucked in my opinion. It bored the shit out of me. Maybe not now if I read it, but the teenage version of me absolutely hated it, and it just kind of all the books I was forced to read kind of killed my interest for years until I met my wife, who got me a Kindle and got me back into reading. And I just never got into comics, but I would like to go ahead. Oh, I was gonna say I would like to hear that name one more time so I can write it down.
Oh, Comixology, and it's all lowercase except for the X in the middle.
Okay. I'm sorry about cutting you off. What were you gonna say?
Oh, well, yeah. I mean, the best way to get teenagers not to read is to force them to try and read.
Right.
And I think Kurt Vonnegut would, he probably found it deeply ironic that Slaughterhouse-Five became a staple of high school reading, a blind compulsory reading, because it's a book about the horrors of military regimentation and following orders and doing terrible things in the name of following orders. So yeah, I think you're right. I mean, even if I love something, if somebody's trying to force it down my throat, I don't love it anymore. So yeah, I agree.
You know what the weird part was, though, is back then, even though I just flat out hated reading, I still wrote all the time. I've done it for as long as I can remember. And it was really focused on horror, and there was comedy mixed into it, which I've always loved. One of my favorite movies is Shaun of the Dead. Big fan of that.
Absolutely.
It mixes the two genres perfectly.
Yes. No, that's a great film. It's really, yeah, I think my preference is for horror and comedy together, because horror, just qua horror, for me is too much. I mean, the world is horrific enough. Horror, properly conceived, is an escape. And there are some horror films that are truly horrifying that aren't that funny. Like I said, Halloween 2. But at the same
that's not funny.
But at the same time, things like torture porn. I mean, I can appreciate the novelty and the skill with which some films or stories films are made or stories are told. But I think ultimately my two favorite horror films are Return of the Living Dead from 1985 and Reanimator from 1985. Yes. And those films are comedies as much as they are horror films.
Yeah. Return of the Living Dead is hilarious. It's a great film.
Yeah. And they can get away with a lot more crazy stuff.
Yep.
Because they have a comedic edge. If you're not leavening your horror with comedy, I think that you're limiting yourself somewhat, because I don't think people emotionally can deal with too much of any one emotion. It's just overpowering after a while. It's sort of like going to an art museum and trying to look at all the paintings in one afternoon. You start to lose something. And
yep.
It's like sensory overload.
Absolutely.
And so you have to give people an experience that is at least somewhat reminiscent of reality. And reality is always a blend of drama, horror, comedy, romance, whatever. And you may be emphasizing one aspect of reality over another, but if you completely ignore the other aspects, I think you start to lose something in your ability to tell a story.
Yeah, it's really good to blend the two, horror and comedy in particular, because if you have a moment where it's super serious, everything's going crazy, and then you kind of, even if it's like black comedy where it's just like kind of not for everyone, but it's still something where you can breathe. Because if you got a novel that's just straight up dark, I mean, it does work for some books, but me personally, like you, I want a little room to breathe. That way, when the horror comes back, it's going to affect me all the more.
Yeah. And that's not to say, I mean, one of the greatest horror comedies I've ever encountered, even though I don't think it was written as a horror comedy, is The Trial by Franz Kafka. And I couldn't read more than 15 pages of that book without feeling claustrophobic. That's how powerful it is. But at the same time, there's this level of absurdity to what's going on that makes it funny, not laugh out loud funny, but it's just, there's this, there's a sense undergirding everything that, even though what's happening to the protagonist is terrible, it's also absurd and therefore, funny or at least amusing in a way. And it makes the suffocating nature of the narrative more tolerable.
Yeah, that's a good observation. I don't think you can really have a good story without those components. Maybe you could, but I don't know. I'm trying to think about it, and it seems a little unrealistic, which takes me out of the story.
Yeah, I mean, there are stories that are well told that, don't necessarily have much leavening, that are just focused on one emotional state of being. But it's hard to pull off. And I'm thinking of Frederick Forsyth's Day of the Jackal. It's one of my favorite novels, and it's about an attempt on the life of the French premier and the French government's attempt to stop the assassin. And it's one of my favorite novels because it absolutely gets you and it doesn't let go. And you just have to read it. You read it compulsively because you want to see what happens. And it is so in the moment that you're just thinking about what's going to happen next. That sort of thing capitalizes on a not quite, I wouldn't say monochromatic experience, but something that is very highly attuned to one particular, state of mind. And it does so very well. And so there are some stories that are best told that way, but I think by and large, in horror at least, you have to allow people to breathe every once in a while. It's like there are rhythms in stories, right?
Mm-hmm.
There are ups and downs. You have to give people a breather, or else you're just going to exhaust them, or you're never going to develop the character sufficiently to get people invested in them.
And it's like we kind of said, it's unrealistic to just have one emotion because people are full of everything. If it's two-dimensional, I'm not really interested in reading about it. If it's someone, Game of Thrones, George R. R. Martin, he nails it. Like there's, do you watch that? Did you watch that show or read the books?
No, I did not. I'm actually not a big fantasy person.
I'm not huge into it. I love Tolkien. I love C.S. Lewis. If it's done right, I'll probably watch or read it. But I watched the show. I have not read the books yet, and it was a show that me and my wife really enjoyed. And there was this one character, Jaime Lannister, who pushes. I don't know if it's really a spoiler at this point. The book's been out since the 90s. So I feel okay with saying this part. He pushes a kid out the window, and the kid survives, becomes crippled. But you're going to not like that guy. He's a very easy guy to dislike. And throughout the TV show, he goes through crazy shit. Like his hand gets cut off, and they hang it around his neck. And at one point, I just stopped and I go to my wife. I'm like, why am I rooting for this guy now? He tried killing a kid by pushing him out a window, and he becomes it's fucked up, but he becomes likable because if you have empathy for a character, then you're gonna really root for them, and the only way to do that is by kind of making it a 3D character where he's battling himself.
Well, who's your favorite?
Herself.
You've seen Silence of the Lambs, right?
It's one of my favorite books, and I do really like the movie.
Who's your favorite character?
It's Anthony Hopkins' portrayal of Hannibal Lecter.
Yeah, of course.
He's more interesting than Buffalo Bill.
He's more interesting than all the other characters put together. And
yeah.
The last you went, notwithstanding how terrible he is, you don't want to see him die. No,
and I really do wish that they that prequel book. I don't know if you ever read Hannibal Rising.
Yes, I did.
I don't know how you feel about it, but it just didn't work for me. I personally love Silence of the Lambs, Red Dragon, and I was a big fan of Hannibal. The ending, it's fine how it is. I wish
that scene in the movie. I mean, it's very different from the book, but the scene at the end, the epilogue of Hannibal. The movie when he's sitting on the plane and he offers the little boy the brain matter. He's like the little boy is just like him. He's a gourmand, and he says, "I didn't like what they offered us for dinner." And he says, "Nor should you. It's not even food as I understand the term." right? And then he said, "What's that?" That's very good. It's like, well, as my mother said to me, and your mother probably said to you, it's always good to try new things, I mean, of course, it's just horrifying, but how can you not love that at the same time?
No, it's horrifyingly interesting. And in the book, I thought it was kind of better portrayed because the mom in the same little boy gets pissed off and questions, "What the fuck are you giving my kid? I don't even know you."
Yeah.
But the part of Hannibal's life I wish they wrote, that Thomas Harris wrote a book about, was during his killing spree when he killed a student or students from Princeton, and when he went through this whole thing as a doctor, and they showed little piece of that in Red Dragon. I just wish that if he came back to that character, that's got to be the one. That's got to be the timeline that he uses, I would hope.
Well, that's the thing. I mean, Hannibal Lecter is terrible. He kills some people just because it's convenient to do so. It's not like everyone he kills and eats is the free-range rude that Barney describes in Hannibal, right? Mm. And that makes his character far less palatable and likable,
Right.
But at the same time, your experience, at least with the Anthony Hopkins Hannibal Lecter, is how can you not like this guy? If anything, he's kind of like he gets to say all the things people want to say but don't, right?
Right. Yep.
It's like the fool in the Shakespeare play. Sometimes one of the most interesting things you can do as a writer is to put interesting comments or observations that would otherwise be radioactive into the characters that people don't like. And it creates conflict because you don't like this character, but you can't help but agree with them.
Yeah, that's a good point. And you know what else makes, just one more point about the Hannibal Lecter series, I find it fascinating, and maybe it's changed because he came out with a new book last year. I haven't looked since before then or after then. You're not going to find any interviews by Thomas Harris. There's nothing. There's no documentaries. There's no videos of him. There's no text interviews of him because since forever he's kind of refused to have any media interaction. And I think that kind of not knowing anything about him kind of adds to the whole attraction.
Yeah, well, it's like J.D. Salinger, who famously shunned the press. It adds it. He would rather have his work speak for itself, and there's something to be said for that. So
I don't know if I would do that personally, because I made my own podcast for a reason. I like to talk to people.
Well, he can get away with it because people want to read and buy his books.
Yeah.
But if he did, I wonder if he would do that. I just don't know if he could afford to do that if he wasn't as, if he didn't sell as many books as he sold. So
he's only got 6 books.
Right. Well, that's all he needs, right? I mean, as far as I'm concerned, he's one of the greatest crime novelists who ever lived. So, I mean, Raymond Chandler had 5 novels, and he's one of the greatest writers who ever lived, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah, it's hard to argue. Silence of the Lambs and Red Dragon in particular are just like the quintessential dark horror crime, whatever you want to call it. They're like the books. I don't read books a second time normally because there's so many good ones that I need to read at least once. But I'm pretty sure Red Dragon and just the whole trilogy, I'm pretty sure I'd read that again down the line.
Oh, yeah.
So I just wanted to ask you one more thing about what you want to write. If there's anything in particular that graphic novel-wise or a novel or a screenplay, is there anything in particular that you want to tackle?
Well, I've got a lot of projects that I've completed that I'd like to see the light of day potentially. I actually have I read a screenplay that I'd like to see developed called Cat Problem. And the premise is that there's this small or medium-sized town in Colorado that has a large feral cat population, and it's kind of the calling card of the community. It's an attraction. There are like 20,000 feral cats that live around the town, and
holy shit.
Prefer them. I was thinking about I think in Istanbul, there are lots of cats that are semi-domesticated. Calling them feral is maybe too much. They're semi-domesticated. People take care of them on a community basis, and they just live outside and maybe go in when it's cold. But, they're welcome members of the community. And I was thinking, what would happen if some government contractor decided to try and weaponize them? And so the premise is this government contractor weaponizes a form of the rabies virus, makes it applicable only to cats, and tests it by unleashing infected cats on the local population of wild cats. So the whole cat population of the town becomes rabid and attacks the town. And they test to see what happens when a town is attacked by their new weapon.
So it kind of have an effect like the Crazies, that film The Crazies.
Except the Crazies are the cats.
No, it's not cats, but
no, what I mean is in my story, the Crazies are the cats, not the people. So, but you're right. It's like that. And so the story is about this cheerleader who is caught up in the middle of this, and with the help of one of her friends and the shop teacher in her high school, who's actually a war vet who teaches people right out of the anarchist handbook how to survive instead of teaching them how to build, household tchotchkes. They go and they try to rescue her high school crush from the hospital in the middle of this siege. So
I'd watch that.
Well, thank you.
Yeah, it sounds fucking awesome.
That's the next project I'd like to try and get developed. So.
Well, if you want, keep in touch about that, because I would be very interested in that. Is there any other things that you would like to discuss or let people know about Stay Alive in particular, or any other projects of the past that you've worked on?
Now, why don't we just keep this focused on Stay Alive?
Sure.
So, just for the time, I mean, I've got a podcast. I actually did a podcast story that was people might like. If they like Stay Alive, they'll like this. It's called Making Things Click, and it's on the Scary Story podcast, part of the Chilling Tales for Dark Nights podcast network, and it's about a teenager who posts a story or posts a video of himself apparently taking revenge on his high school bully, and he sets an example. He creates a viral phenomenon of people doing terrible things to people that bedevil or oppress them, and causes a nationwide epidemic of violence, of vigilante violence. So, and it's available at Simply Scary Podcast website.
Is that connection to the children's horror story books?
Children's, I'm not sure. I'm sorry. No.
Story. Oh, you know what? I think I'm mixing it up with Scary Stories in the Dark.
Yeah, there's a podcast network. The guy who runs it is named Craig Groshek, and it's called, I think it's Chilling Tales, but it's Chilling Tales, I think is the name of the LLC, but Chilling Tales for Dark Nights is the primary brand, and Simply Scary is another brand, and I read a story that was dramatized in 2018 called Making Things Click, and that's what I'm talking about.
Okay.
I'm very interested in mob violence because it terrifies me, frankly. It's like the comment, I think it's Madison in the Federalist, who said that even if every Athenian citizen had been a Socrates, every Athenian assembly would still have been a mob. You think about Socrates as one of the most brilliant and humane people who ever lived, and but if you get enough of them together, this herd mob mentality takes over, and they start doing terrible things. Yeah,
it's a scary thing. It's real, and we see it every day.
Yes.
When my wife was pregnant with our boy, she was in some mommy Facebook groups, and she would tell me about them. And you would think that a bunch of women that are pregnant would be able to sympathize with each other, and it's nothing like that with some people.
No, I think that people are capable of terrible things and wonderful things, and it's a constant struggle to sort of choose the good over the bad.
Absolutely.
That's tradition.
Yeah. So besides everything we covered for Stay Alive, is there anything else that you talk about or tell us where people can buy Stay Alive?
Stay Alive is available online at Amazon and Barnes & Noble, and Comixology and Kindle also on Amazon. And if you go to the Marcosia website, you can find the various distributors for it. It's available throughout the world through other booksellers. And certain comic shops, I think, at least I know of at least one comic shop that's carrying it. That's Forbidden Planet in Manhattan. But given the coronavirus quarantining, your best bet is probably to, at this point, is to order it online.
Yeah, I would think so, especially Manhattan. That's a super crowded. What is it, like 3 million people living in that city?
You don't endanger yourself just to go get a physical copy. You just, order it online.
So by the time this episode airs, it'll be sometime in June.
Okay. Hopefully it'll be more resolved then. I hope so. It's really scary,
Yeah.
The real world is a lot scarier than most of anything you would read in a horror book. So.
Yeah, when I read Stay Alive, I honestly laughed a lot because it was just so over the top, and I knew that I'm glad that we talked about this because everything that I kind of thought was what you were going for was confirmed with you basically telling me that's why I wrote it. So it's funny to me. Parts are funny. Some are brutal. I think it's a good book, good graphic novel. It's worth reading, and it's a good reflection on modern society. I would buy it. I think it's worth your time. But that's just my opinion. And where can people follow you?
On Twitter, let me double check and make sure. It's at NovelStay, capital N and capital S. So at capital NOVEL, capital STAY. And on Instagram, Stay Alive GN. Just one word.
Stay Alive What was that? Stay Alive what?
GN, all lowercase.
GN. Okay. I wasn't aware of the Instagram. That's actually all the questions I had there, Jim. Is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
I thank you very much for this opportunity. I greatly appreciate it.
Oh, absolutely. I had a great time talking to you. And any projects you have in the future, or if you just want to get together and chat again, let me know, because I enjoyed this, and I hope that this actually gets you guys some more sales. That'd be great, and I would love to know.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Hey, my pleasure. It was great talking to you, Jim, and I hope you have a good day.
You too. Thank you.
All right. See ya. Bye, everybody.
We are in your mind. We are all around. You are now leading Dead Headspace.
As far as rules go, we want you to know that we are looking at a maximum word count of 4,000 words, and we're mostly interested in standalone prose fiction stories, so no TV, movie, play script treatments, or novel and novella extracts. Fuck. It's gonna take us all night to record 3 minutes of advertisement, and that's
Hollywood. That's Hollywood, baby.
So I would say, for more information, go to deadheadreviews.com/I fucking forget. We want you to note that we are interested in standalone prose fiction stories, no television, movie, or play script treatments, or nope. Try that again.
Nope, too long. Take two. September 15th to the 30th. Hope to see you there.
Hope to see you there.
I don't know why I said that.
I wish we could put the face you made as part of the end of that. I guess.